Well, I suggest that we start so long.
Mm.
I would like to, first of all, say good evening or good morning, or whatever the case may be, and welcome very much to our third webinar in the series. I think that most of you do know Professor Philip Nel, but in case you don't, he is teaching political economy and ethics as well as international relations at the University of Otago, which I believe is the oldest university in New Zealand. He is our own, he's one of our own, as he has received his doctorate from University of Stellenbosch, where he had taught till 2002. And during that period, he has also, this is when I first met Philip, he was the head of Soviet studies, which I presume gives him a deeper insight into the carry on of Russia today, I should imagine. But that's beside the point. The point is that Philip has emigrated to New Zealand in 2002, and as you can see, well, we know he's still there. He's an alumnus of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, and he's also a research associate of the Arnold Bergstresser Institute in Freiburg in Germany, as well as being an extraordinary professor at Stellenbosch University. He has written widely on the topics of international relations, South Africa's foreign policy, and he had also published widely in other areas, over 100 articles and chapters in books and so on. So, Philip, thank you very much for being with us today, for willing to do the presentation, which sounds very intriguing indeed. And thank you very much to Laurence for agreeing to lead the discussion. And welcome to all of you for joining us. So over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much, Ursula, and thank you very much for organizing this. We really appreciate it. Yes, in the last, I would say, 10 years and so on, my attention has shifted a bit away from international relations, South African foreign policy, more towards studying the psychology of inequality and why people accept inequality more readily than they should actually. We academics always complain that people don't always behave like our models suggest they should, and it's been an eye-opener for me to actually see how wrong some of our models about human behavior actually is when it comes to things like inequality. So this is the fourth installment of a series of studies that I've been doing on this topic, and I've become interested in the phenomenon of irreligion or non-religion, if you want to call it. And given the fact that recent waves of the World Value Surveys allows us also to distinguish between various notions of democracy, I found it interesting to see what the irreligious or the nots think about democracy, and that's the focus of my presentation today. So I'm going to move through the slides. Unfortunately, my animation feature might not be working so well, but I hope you'll be, oh, so it is actually working, so good. So some of you may know that there's been a flood of literature just the last 4 or 5 years trying to explain what's going on with social democracy. Despite the uptick in Germany last year, social democracy has had a bit of a difficult time as far as elections are concerned. And the challenge is how to explain the decline of the fortunes of social democracy. Some people argue that it has to do with the fact that many of the supporters of social democracy no longer subscribe to the fundamental values associated with old style social democracy, namely state-led redistribution and a more egalitarian society. And so distinctions are being made between, on the one hand, demand side explanations of the decline or change in social democracy, and on the other hand, I would say, supply side explanations. So on the supply side, some of you may know the recent book by Mudge, 2018. She tries to explain what's been happening with social democracy by focusing on how the movement have become very professionalized, specifically as far as the economic experts are concerned, working for social democratic parties, and that has accompanied the shift to the right, which unfortunately has also meant a declining support from voters in many countries. On the demand side, people have emphasized the fact that traditional supporters, such as trade union members, their numbers have been declining, so there's less of a traditional support base for social democratic parties. Piketty and his co-authors have coined the phrase the Brahmin left, showing that educated voters tend to, highly educated voters tend to vote left these days, while traditional blue-collar workers have shifted more to the right. I think I fit in more in with the demand side explanation, but I noticed that one thing that is underexplored is, of course, the attitudes of important constituencies of the left. And there are different constituencies, but I will show you that I think the knots, the irreligious, are quite an important constituency on the left. And so I'm trying to explain what's been happening with social democracy by looking at an important constituency on the demand side of the explanation. So here's a definition used by Colin Campbell, who wrote first book on the irreligious in 1971. This comes from encyclopedia entry that he wrote about irreligion. So he refers to it as the active rejection of either religion in general or any of its more specified organized forms. And he makes a distinction between this and secularity, which simply refers to the absence or the ignorance of or an attitude of not taking religion seriously, either pro or contra. So I would like to follow on this distinction by referring to the Knots as an irreligious group, and therefore my selection criteria tries to accommodate this notion of active rejection. So you'll see that I use three categories to build up this group of knots. This is all based on world value surveys, various waves that I'll explain just now. There are three categories here. The not religious, people who deliberately choose the category self-description of not religious, but not atheist. People are given a choice to choose between religious, non-religious, convinced atheist, and don't know. So the not religious, about 33% of the total sample that I put together would come from that category. And then you have the convinced atheist, 3.4% of the total. And then there are also the so-called nuns. Some of you may have heard of the term nuns. That refers to people who, when confronted with a list of denominations, religious denominations, would say, no, none of them. I belong to none of them. But what is important here is this right-hand column, because I only select those who explicitly say that religion is not important in their life. So just to capture that element of the definition that there's an active, or at least implicitly active, rejection of religion, allows one to identify these knots as those people who claim that religion is not important in their lives. It's important to make this distinction because you'll be surprised to see that many of convinced atheists say that religion is important in their life, or even some of the nuns claim that religion is important in their lives. So to distinguish between them and the committed knots, I introduce this criterion, so to speak, a selection criterion of they have to indicate that religion is not important in their life. So yeah, yes, just something about the data sources and the sample size. I used the combined uh, European value surveys and world value surveys data set from 1981 to 2020. 7 waves altogether, and it constitutes a sample of over 200,000 observations, nested in 150 country waves, and these waves are nested in 36 consolidated democracies. So I focus explicitly on so-called consolidated democracies, and I simply use polity 2 scale full score as the indicator or the criterion to determine which countries are full democracies or not, or full consolidated democracies or not. It's important to look at different levels because about 14.3% of the variation is found on levels above the observation level. So we have to look at the country wave features and also the country level features. So here are some trends for the 36 consolidated democracies in my data set. You'll see that Taiwan and Trinidad and Tobago, and Chile, we don't have, and also Poland, we don't have long time series. Unfortunately, the specific data on notions of democracy are a bit scarce, and so I lose eventually 5 of the countries in my final analysis, ending only with 31 consolidated democracies. What is important in this graph is to see that there's, in general, an upward trend, both in terms of the percentage of people who qualify as knots, according to my definition, as a percentage of the respondents, the blue line, while the red line indicates those knots who at the same time also identify themselves as being on the left of the political spectrum. And I'm going to focus on those knots specifically in the rest of the analysis and contrasting their beliefs with other people on the left, but who are not knots, who have not indicated that they're not religious. I believe that the knots constitute an important constituency of the left. On average, 42% of respondents who voted in 36 consolidated democracies are knots, so it's quite a sizable portion. 65% of the knots place themselves left on the political spectrum. Of these 65%, 82% of those 65 actually put themselves in the center left. So on a 10-point scale, you would say number 6, 7, and 8 constitute this center left position. And as I say, 82% of those who are knots indicate that they're and their left place themselves in that center left category. And I associated that roughly, I know it's not exactly correct, but roughly I associated that with support for potential support for social democratic parties. 51% of voters who self-declare to be left on the political spectrum are knots, and 53% of voters who say that the left party appeals to them are knots. So you can see that it's quite a sizable potential support base for social democratic. They also tend to be somewhat more politically active or disposed towards political action. Measured in terms of political participation measures already developed by Almond and Verba way back in the 1960s, such as whether people are willing to sign petitions, join demonstrations, legal demonstrations, boycotts, etc., etc. So they're about 37% more disposed than others on the left to participate in politics. So they're both significant in terms of size and also in terms of their disposition towards participation in politics. So I've run a number of various types of hierarchical level regressions. I'm not going to bore you with all the detailed figures from those regressions. The first one is, of course, a Logat type regression, trying to find out what are the important features of the knots. I can summarize it by saying they tend to be young, urban-based, educated, single males who favor independence as an attribute, also in children. They reject authority in general, and they have no confidence in churches. And specifically, this last one is quite an important one. So here's a result from a hierarchical Logat model with the 36 democracies. You can see how strongly, in terms of the odds ratio, the no confidence in churches feature here at the bottom right-hand corner. There are more males than females who claim that they are knots or fall into my category of knots. They tend to be younger. So the birth cohorts I have here contrast the birth cohorts with the reference category would be baby boomers. So birth cohort 2 would be people born in the 60s. Cohort 3, people born in the 70s, and birth cohort 4 would be people born in the 80s and beyond. You can also see that the higher levels of education, level 3 means university education, features strongly, and all the others are also positive. The bottom one is just an indication of the number of knots as a percentage of the population, just to add a national control variable. But the outstanding feature is there's no confidence in the churches, and I'll come back to that a bit later. So here's just another way of looking at that same, compared to other left voters, the left knots are very, very, have very, very low levels of confidence. It is an important question to ask. I don't have much time to go into detail this morning or this afternoon, but it is important to ask now, which way does the causal arrow run? Is it, do people become knots because they have no confidence in churches, or do they have no confidence in the churches because they are knots? I believe, and it's more of a hunch than based on real hard evidence up to now. Well, in future work, I'll try to tease this out a little bit more. I believe that it's likely that people are knots because of distrust in organized religion. And you can see it as a form of anti-clericalism that emerges amongst these left knots, therefore. Some other differences, significant in terms of the T value involved, the differences with others on the left. They have a weaker commitment to equality versus freedom when they have to choose between those two values. They have a weaker commitment to equality than others on the left, but they have a stronger commitment to meritocracy. They're also more likely to mention unselfishness as a desirable characteristic for children to have. So they're not necessarily egoists in the full sense of the term, but some of their other attitudes do emphasize that they place a very high level of value on independence and rejection of authority and so on. they're less likely than others on the left to be a member of a civil society organization. They're less committed to environmental matters. I found that interesting, a bit surprising. But they're strongly committed to gender equality. Also a strong commitment to liberal notion of democracy, which I'll say a little bit more about right now. But overall, they're less satisfied with their household income, even if you control for the fact that singleness usually is associated with less satisfaction with household income levels. So in waves 5, 6, and 7 of the World Value Surveys, they've introduced a number of questions in terms of which one can distinguish between three notions of democracy. With the red arrow here, I mark those that I regard as indicators of a social democratic notion of democracy. Governments tax the rich and subsidize the poor. People receive state aid for unemployment. The state makes people incomes equal. Those three, I would say, is an indication of social democratic notions, traditional social democratic notions of democracy. You can contrast that with more authoritarian notions of democracy based on, for instance, religious authorities ultimately interpret the laws. People obey their rulers, and the army takes over when government is incompetent. Welsel and others in their recent publications have used this as an indicator of authoritarian notions of democracy. And then the final category would be a liberal notion, which would be reflected in number 133 here. People choose their leaders in free elections. 136, civil rights protect people from state oppression. And 139, women have the same rights as men. So as I said in the previous slide, the Knots tend to have a strong commitment to liberal notions of democracy, but as we'll see in the next slide, unfortunately, not a very strong commitment to the social. So here's the results from a multi-level regression, which indicates that the not religious, the Knots, have less commitment to social democratic. That's why they fall on the left-hand side of the red vertical line. The other indicators here are different control variables that I've introduced. There are also some others that one can use, but I found commonly used ones such as the question whether there's a proportional representation system in the elections, which in other research have been associated more strongly with social democracy votes. They turned out not to be significant, so I haven't included. Oh, I did include it here at the end. You can see it's not positively related. It's actually negative, but it's not significant because the confidence interval crosses the red line. So it's an indication that that is not a significant factor. I've also tried to see whether it makes a difference whether a country has a Roman Catholic background, Protestant background, whether it has a Orthodox background, or whether it has a Buddhist background. So all those religious categories didn't turn out to be significant. So the important thing that I draw from this analysis is that the Knots are not very committed to the social democratic notion of democracy. There is a positive relationship now on a country level between public welfare spending and the percentage of Knots. Some of the literature suggests, therefore, that Knots or the not religious are people who actually kicking away the ladders that brought them to the place where they actually are. or where they actually find themselves. The argument is that welfare spending is one of the indicators that is associated with the rise of secularism in modern societies, uh, but it is actually based on exactly that factor that originally encourages people to become religious, what Engelhardt at Norris calls existential insecurity. So if a society provides a means to overcome existential insecurity, that actually encourages, it would seem, people to become not religious. And that's why it is claimed that they're actually kicking away the ladder that brought them to the position where they are. So there's also a second sense in which one can say they may be kicking away the ladder. I haven't really explored this in much detail, but one can revisit the notion of secularism and actually interpret it as a form of accommodation of moral principles that originally uh, evolved uh, within a religious context. So Talcott Parsons made some interesting comments way back in the 70s about this. So the concept secularization has been widely interpreted to mean a one-way change, namely the sacrifice of religious claims, obligations, and commitments in favor of secular interests. I would say that's the mainstream interpretation of secularization today. The other possibility, which I think is the one that I would like to explore a little bit further, however, should not be forgotten, namely that the secular order may change in the direction of close approximation of the normative morals provided by a religion or by religion more generally. So if we associated at least some religions with social welfare principles, looking after the poor, providing uh, relief on a wide scale to the poor, once that becomes institutionalized in modern democratic societies, uh, religion disappears as a motivating factor, uh, but the whole secular order can trace its very features back to the secular, to the religious background or religious history. And one can explore it in different types of religions. There's some nice recent studies have been conducted on the religious basis of different forms of social democracy in Europe. Distinctions made between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and you're all familiar with those distinctions. This is something that I need to explore a little bit further, but I just thought I would just throw it in here as an interesting theoretical construct. Just to show you that the Knots are they strongly endorse individualistic justice issues, which is an index reflecting what people think about euthanasia, abortion, and gay rights. You can see that they're very strongly in favor of those rights. Uh, Again, the no confidence in churches is an important control factor here that one has to introduce. I don't think I need to go into any of the others. Confidence in politics doesn't really play a significant role here. PR, proportional representation, just about becomes significant. Uh, this is reflective also of people who've done similar work. Ron Engelhardt's recent book on the religion's sudden decline also highlights this fact. Uh, he doesn't go into much detail, however, on the knots as far as their social democratic or the notions of democracy is concerned, but this shouldn't be come as a surprise to anyone who's familiar with his work and also the earlier work that he did with Philip Nel. What is important, though, is in terms of these new or these new justice issues, abortion, gay rights, and euthanasia, is that the knots, which are here reflected in the blue lines, tend to be compared to others on the left, uh, to be strongly committed in all countries where we have data for more strongly committed to these new justice issues compared to others on the left. They do tend to go in the same direction, but it's striking that the knots always come up higher on the scale than the others. So one can say that on the one hand, the knots definitely is a fifth column in the ranks of the left, in the sense that they are undermining the commitment to social democratic values of equity and redistribution within those uh, movements. And if you think of the recent work by Polacco in West European politics, he shows that the move away from these values leads to declining vote shares for social democratic parties under conditions of increasing income and wealth inequality. So, so indirectly, one can say the Knots are contributing to this declining vote share that social democratic parties uh, are receiving. So here's just again based on country level and country wave data, a rough indication of that. The increase in the number of knots, which is now group mean centered to indicate some change over time. You can see that the increase in the number of knots, which is reflected on the horizontal axis at the bottom, leads to is associated at least with a decline in the percentage of votes that go towards social democratic parties. Now I know full well that there might be many other factors also explaining this decline, but just to illustrate the point that one can look at the knots as some form of fifth column. But that's not the final word. One can also say that the knots can also be seen as a vanguard of the new left. And I apologize for these militaristic images. Fifth columns and vanguards come from the military. Not that I'm a militaristic man myself, but just for the sake of presentation. The knot can be seen as a vanguard of the new left in which individualized new justice issues of choice determine the identity of the left. So, for someone like myself who are concerned about the fate of social democracy in the world, these findings are a bit sobering. Uh, One should not necessarily assume that all those who declare themselves to be on the left necessarily anymore reflect the values traditionally associated with the moderate left. And do not seem to be an important feature of that phenomenon. So I have a few conclusions just to illustrate that I believe that the irreligious is an important part of the demand side explanation of why the left has shifted away from traditional emphasis. They tend to be single male, educated, independent, employed, urbanites who value freedom of choice over equality and who distrust churches. This anti-clerical dimension is most likely due to the fact that churches represent the antithesis of these choice values. Not reject religion because churches tend to be opposed to these new justice issues. And using again Piketty's phrase, they represent an important part of the Brahman left, who vote left because they regard the left as a vehicle for promoting choice values, new justice issues, and not necessarily because it promotes values of social welfare and redistribution. Good. I have some references here, but you're welcome to take a look at those at a later stage. So I'm sorry to have taken up for a long time, but love to hear what you guys have to say. This is work in progress, so any suggestion for improvement, anything else that I need to explore, please. All comments very welcome.
Thank you very much, Philip. That was most enlightening and interesting. And I would like to call on Laurence, who is supposed to lead this discussion, for him to state his first impressions and comment on what he thinks about it, the whole issue, which is actually a bit sad in the sense that, you know, there's such a reconfiguration on the left that who is going to look after the poor and the downtrodden, as it were.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. As you say, this is this is a subject which has attracted an interesting and lively academic debate in the last 3-4 years, and you've referred to the most important recent publications, and you're obviously on track to make a significant contribution to those debates. As I think you indicated, there's a line of analysis which is about supply side, and there is a line which is demand side. And then in your case, you've looked rather more carefully at one particular component of a potential social base for social democracy, and you found that that component isn't as well, the attitudes, the beliefs, the orientations of that component as measured by WBS and EBS and so on, isn't as encouraging as one might have thought, although it's mixed. I think that's my, as it were, overview, or my takeaway from what you've said, and it raises a number of interesting questions. I mean, I don't want to spend much time on the methodology, but I'm not the person who's best on the methodology in any case. But I would like to ask, because all the way through your talk, you said, you know, the nons do more of this than the others. And then on your charts, you could see a red line, which was the norm, and you could see how the nons were distributed in relation to the norm. What wasn't entirely clear to me was two things. How big, in what cases were the differences really big rather than, you know, statistical noise? And secondly, it wasn't always clear to me what the norm was from which the variation was being measured. The norm could be how the knots compare with support for the left as a whole, or the norm could be how the knots compare with all WES respondents. And I think I wasn't clear about that from, I'm afraid, you know, no doubt in reading it more closely, one will be able to get that. But I think maybe that needs to be made a bit clearer in order for the reader to know quite what's being argued, what conclusions to draw from it. And the other sort of slightly semi-methodological point is you've got 31 countries, haven't you? That are
yes,
left. Will you show us the charts for the countries? And, you know, just looking very quickly at the charts as you put them up on the screen, I got the sense that, well, there are several variations that strike me. First of all, I think, but tell me if I'm wrong, I think this means that each of those countries is weighted equally in the aggregation. In other words, if you've got a sample of 1,000 opinions in Iceland and 1,000 opinions in the United States, you say the overall total is the 2,000 people, of whom, you know, one is a sample from an extremely small population, and the other is a sample from a vast society. Have I got that right? Or is it the case, because you did also talk about something like, I forget, 200,000 or something databases. Is the aggregation that you're using weighted by the population of the countries involved? That's another methodological thing which I think would influence my conclusions about what you're saying. Moving beyond that, I did sort of read the Piketty that you refer to, the Brahmins one, in order to see it by comparison, because he also uses 30 consolidated democracies, and I believe that in that case, the total universe involved is weighted by the populations, though I'm not absolutely sure of that. And here's the sentence, or here's the paragraph in that article by Piketty, which I thought might be worth comparing to what you say, and then you can help me understand how far you're really different. We exploit the other variable. I mean, the basic Piketty argument is that it's the rise of the tendency of the most educated to vote left is the big change over the last 40, 50 years. That all the other determinants of voting left are unchanged. So the other variables in our data relate to age, geography, religion, gender, and other socioeconomic variables. The main conclusion is that there has been no major realignment of voters along these other dimensions comparable to the one observed in the case of education. Younger voters are more likely to vote for social democratic parties, but that was already the case, and it's by the same scale as in the 1950s. Rural, urban, and religious cleavages have remained stable or have even decreased in most countries in our data set. But it's basically the same. The main exception is gender, where women used to vote more for the right, and they now vote more for the left. That's my takeaway on your issue from Piketty, and I'm not sure that it matches quite to the portrait that you've been giving us, and I'd like your comments on that.
Okay, so shall I take those 3 points one by one? Let's start with Piketty at the end. Of course, the distinction between my approach and his is that he's just looking at the support base for voting for the left. So he bases his analysis on post-election surveys where people then indicate for whom that they vote. And it might still be true that most of the religious groups vote for the right. What I focus on, however, is what do those people who vote for, say they vote for the left, really believe about democracy? Not necessarily whether they vote left or right, but what do they believe democracy should be all about? And I think that I would therefore challenge the notion that one should only look at the actual voting patterns to determine whether religious people or non-religious people have the assessment of democracy or a notion of democracy that actually reflects their voting behavior. Welsel, and I think I have a reference here to him, Kruse, Raflik, and Welsel, they point out that people say that they vote democratic, but they have autocratic notions of democracy. So it might also be true of the nots. The nots may be saying, yes, we vote left, and therefore in Piketty's figures, it will reflect support for the left, while the religious would vote right. But he doesn't tell us anything about what do the people who vote right believe about democracy, and what do the people who vote left actually believe about democracy. And that's where I zoom in. And I think that's the distinguishing feature between our two analyses. I don't know whether I made that clear enough. So your two methodological points well taken. The one about weighting. One of the good things about the World Value Surveys is, of course, that they use two weighting measures. The one is on the observational level, where they make sure that the sampling of countries in specific ways is done in such a way that at least it roughly reflects the composition, the demographic composition of a country. So observation weights are important. But then they also introduce what one can call a post-estimation weight, where they they create an equivalized number of observations. You can either choose the weight that equivalizes the observations to 1,000 or to 1,500, and that takes into consideration the size of the population from which the sample is drawn. So to answer your question, yes, there is an inbuilt weighing of the population size built into these weights that they provide, these post-estimation weights that they provide. Your first is an important point. I probably didn't make it clear enough here. The reference group that I use in the analysis, specifically in the regression analysis, would be people on the left who are not knots, who do not qualify for the category of the knot. So I'm not comparing the knots with the rest of the respondents in general. I'm comparing them only to the others who indicate that they left, but who do not qualify to be regarded as knots. So the contrast is between the left knots and the left others, so to speak.
Yeah. And therefore, last question, how big are those differences? I mean, there are clearly differences, but some of them may really not be very consequential in terms of the big issue that you're trying to address.
Yeah, there's one slide where I look specifically at significant differences in terms of the beliefs, and those are all based on a Logat exercises, and I've only selected those items that are significant in terms of traditional standards of significance at the 0.05 cutoff point. So things such as the difference between the lefts who are not knots and the not lefts, as far as choice of between equality and freedom, for instance. I included that contrast to show that it's a significant difference between those two. One thing that I haven't done, and that's something that based on your comments I will do, is to go back to those graphs right at the beginning where I show the 36 countries, and I haven't really measured the exact difference between the number of people who say they are left and they are not, and respondents in general who indicate that they are not. Those differences, although they seem to be running in the same direction, there might be significant differences there, and I need to explore that a bit further. But in general, there are significant differences, and I emphasize significant, statistically significant differences between the knots who are left and the other left as far as support for social democratic notions of democracy versus liberal democratic notions of democracy. The left knots are more pro-gender equality than the other lefts. They're also less concerned about the environment than the other lefts, which I found surprising, and so forth. So I did look at the significance level of the differences there. But I
I
need
don't
to
know
make
whether
this
I
clear.
have.
Yeah.
Do I have room for one more comment, or
Yes.
should I just
No.
very quickly? I mean, then one tries to relate it to individual countries. So I was thinking about it in relation to Britain, and you probably know that the famous statement about the British Labour Party, that the Labour Party owes more to Methodism than to Marx.
Yes,
That's the
yes.
historical picture about the Labour Party. Well, if one thinks about the role of religion in Britain now, it's much less important than it used to be. But even the Church of England, the more conservative churches, are actually being attacked by the Conservative Party as being allies of the covert social democrats. In other words, the religious community, and we're now talking about leadership. I don't know exactly what the faithful think, because the faithful are a very reduced and aging sector, but the top of the church is tending to speak in a more social democratic way than not just the Methodist Church, but the Anglican Church and the Catholic Church and so on, much more position to the left. Now you could say, well, maybe the church hasn't moved, maybe it's the right has moved in a savage capitalist direction. That's another possibility. But certainly, I would say in the case of Britain now, insofar as clericalism has a political influence, which is not very much, it would be as another prop to social democracy.
Yes, I think it's true also of other countries. My experience in South Africa was the same, that the churches, or at least some of the churches, were very strongly committed to social justice issues and specifically inequality issues, much more than the non-religious in South Africa. It's probably one of the reasons why originally the expectation was very high that South Africa would move in a more social democratic direction than it actually did. So that's why I find it a little bit disappointing that, not that I'm a religious man myself, but that the Knots reject religion out of hand because they're ignoring the very important role that religion in the history of the evolution of social democracy played. And as I said in my presentation, it's something that I want to explore a little bit more. But there's some interesting work being done these days on the cultural dimensions of social democracy, and religion emerges here from the 18th century and the 19th century as very important feature of the evolution of social democracy. Of course, in different countries, it plays somewhat of a different role. Northern Europe tend to be a bit more Lutheran, and Lutherans have a specific attitude towards work and to poverty compared to, say, the more Roman Catholic Southern Europe, where there's a greater element of compassion, I would say, towards the poor. So there are country differences, but overall, I would say one has to reappreciate the traditional role that religion has played in the establishment of social democratic values. And therefore, it's a bit disappointing that the Knots reject it out of hand.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, and thank you very much, Laurence. And please let me know if somebody else would like to comment as well. I have one thing that struck me as very odd was when you said that atheists, many atheists declare that religion is actually important to them. Now, isn't that a contradiction in terms?
Yeah. Yes, no, it is somewhat, but you must remember Durkheim already pointed out that religion has these two dimensions. There's the faith dimension, the belief dimension, and then you have the organized institutional form of religion, which associated with churches and their practices and social activities. So some atheists would reject the notion of a God, but they do have some appreciation for this more institutional social dimension of the church. I mean, it's not a large number, but at least 10% of atheists would therefore say that they don't they don't believe in God or in afterlife or in hell and so on, but nevertheless they appreciate this other dimension of religion and say religion is important in my life in that sense.
I see.
Which
Okay.
I found interesting.
Yeah, well, that makes a lot of sense. Yes?
No, I just want to say one further development of the study would be to therefore look at people who reject the notion of God and see if there's a difference there, whether the knots who reject religion would differ from those who are atheists in the sense that they do not believe in the metaphysical beliefs of religion, and whether that makes a difference in terms of their attitudes towards democracy. I have to explore that a bit further.
Thank you very much. Any more questions?
If I may?
Yes, please.
Philip, you mentioned that
Can we see you? Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
You mentioned that you look at a specific component of recent developments as far as votes for social democratic parties are concerned. But if we take a more comprehensive picture within your sample of consolidated democracies, which mostly are also high-income countries, highly literate countries, etc., we can observe in many cases a decline, or a very strong decline, or even breakdown of party identification and party systems. If you take two contrasting cases in this respect, France, a very secular country for a long time, Italy, a highly Catholic Christian dominated country for a long time. The party systems there in both countries during the last 20, 30 years have been almost completely dissolved. And this also applies to the socialist and communist left and to the middle of the road and conservative side. And instead, there have been social movements like the Lega, like the Cinque Stelle, but also Macron and others, which have taken the place, or other parties have taken the place, like the green and ecological parties, or now also more recently an increase of right-wing extremist parties in many of the cases you are considering. So my question is, isn't that a more general phenomenon? We have very high voter volatility in most recent elections, and this fluctuates very strongly depending on particular circumstances, personalities, and other things, and current events. So the overall religious factor in that respect to me seems to be less coming into our view.
Well, I think that's a very good point, and that's why I emphasized in the beginning the distinction between a demand side explanation of what's going on and a supply side. I think the factors that you mentioned all lie on the supply side, where the nature of parties have become less attractive to people. The way the evolution of the party system in many of these countries have become less attractive to citizens, and they look for other political outlets. So no, I take that point fully. I just think that at the same time one shouldn't ignore the fact that maybe the expectations that potential voters on the left have of their parties have also changed, that maybe they look towards parties that more reflect the commitment to what I call the new social, new justice issues, more than the traditional issues. So while I agree with you, if you want to develop a full sense of this, one will have to look at both the demand and the supply side, and maybe take into consideration different circumstances in different countries and the different personalities. But I would say one part of the puzzle is what I try to add, and that is the fact that on the demand side, there's been a weakening amongst at least some supporters on the left of commitment to social democracy. And that's actually all that I want to do. I'm not claiming to develop a full-blown explanation of why things have not gone well with social democracy.
You see, I'm the local chair of the Social Democratic Party here, and I'm also a non-religious person. So it's also related to my own personal experiences.
So you are not?
I'm a not. Yeah.
Okay.
But you're
not.
But you're a baby boomer not, and baby boomer nots tend to be a little bit more pro social democratic values. Actually, I use them as a reference category in one of the slides. I think the experiences that people had during the war and just after the war make that generation somewhat more aware of the social issues that we still confront than the more recent generations. So I think you're a good example, and I would place myself in that category, although I'm a little bit younger, not much younger than you are. I would place myself in that category as well, and not who still believes to some extent in social democracy in the old sense of the term. But my younger colleagues, born in the 70s and 80s, they seem to be more concerned about these other more new justice issues than about the social issues.
Well, thank you very much. That was most enlightening. If somebody, sorry, one more. Sorry.
Well,
Hans-Dieter, okay.
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say that I very much enjoyed and learned a lot from your talk. I have one question. I mean, you start with the basic assumption that those people who you call nots should emphasize equality and state redistribution. But you have said nothing, why you are of that opinion. I mean, it is folklore that, let's say, most the people who vote social democracy have these types of belief systems. But for your whole argument, I think more firm exposition of why you believe that these group of people should be state redistributors.
No, that's a very important point, Dieter. I take it on board because some of the other work that I've been doing on the psychology of inequality tolerance shows that even people on the left tend to be more tolerant of inequality than one would expect. And it has to do with things such as Albert Hirschman's argument about the tunnel effect, for instance, where in a society where there's growing inequality, people take it not as a sign that things are going badly, but actually as a sign that there's some movement, and that eventually my side of the traffic will also start moving. He uses this idea of a tunnel where there's a traffic jam, the two lanes are not moving, but then one lane starts moving forward, and then the other people in the other lane, they can't change lanes, but they take some confidence out of it because there's some movement in the process, and so our chance will also come. So I take that point that maybe one shouldn't assume that people in general, left people in general, necessarily believe that inequality is a bad thing. They might see it as a sign of inspiration that something's good going to happen with them if they work hard enough eventually as well. So I take that point, and I will definitely
Yeah.
address
on
that in some way.
On a macro
Sure.
level, you are also dealing mostly with full-grown social welfare states. And I remember one table in Ron Engelhardt's books where he shows for Denmark that the support for state redistribution systematically declines, in states which have a very, very high taxation and welfare redistribution. So you are living in the world of, let's say, the last century, and many things have changed. And although the values of equality and especially state redistribution may have attraction for people, but they have mostly attraction for the poor, and those who now tend, at least in Germany, vote for the alternative for Germany. I mean, for the populist right-wing party. So, and if you look at the United States, you have the same thing. And the people in the Rust Belt, I mean, it's not what Piketty calls the Brahmist left, These, if you look at them, I would agree with you. But if you look at these kind of nuts who are mostly academics, and God knows, what kind of support base they have, this is a very unlikely group, unless you would not provide good data that they should have a reason to think so or do think so. You have a problem.
Yes. No, I take that point on board. It is an exercise in nostalgia, this study of mine. I'm trying to go back to a previous era where these values were supposed to be taken seriously. But you're quite right. The world has moved on, and one has to make sure that the prior assumption doesn't color the interpretation in the rest of the piece. So I'll take that on board. Thank you.
Could I add that the world is continuing to move on? For example, I think your work ends in 2019, and COVID has serious, I mean, we don't fully know how it works through, but it's unlikely that attitudes to state spending and redistribution will be unaffected by what happened in all these countries as a result of COVID.
Sure,
and what
sure.
is now about to happen as a result of post-Ukraine inflationary pressures.
Yeah, it might be that there's an inward turn again, and the inward turn may be associated with more support for redistributive activities in the form of universal basic income grants and things like that, which is highly debated here in New Zealand, for instance.
Yeah.
The state in various countries, the state have now shown that they can afford to pay population in times of trouble. So the question arises, why not make it a permanent arrangement? And the idea that budget deficits are necessarily bad, I think, are also disappearing, because as long as you have sovereignty over your monetary policy, it is possible for states to almost indefinitely finance social welfare projects. So there's definitely a change of focus due to COVID. So you're quite right. We need to factor that into the story as well. But unfortunately, the survey data not yet available, but I'm sure within the next few years it will become available.
Right. So on that high note, let us finish, and thank you very much, Philip, and all the comments that you have received. I hope they are in somewhat helpful to your future research and focus, and to your own thinking about the whole issue.